Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Intro to Preaching class at Mercer McAfee School of Theology, along with myself and Dr. Greta Fowler. We are co-teachers, and there are some people who've been joining us on YouTube just looking. This is an online class with Mercer University and the McAfee School of Theology. I'm privileged to serve there, along with serving here at Trinity United Church of Christ, doing these unique days of virtual teaching. And we load up different lectures and exercises onto the Mercer website, and then we meet once again. Someone was asking online, where is this? What class is this? Well, this is the preaching class, an online preaching class through Mercer University, the McAfee School of Theology, and it's a real delight to be able to do this class. So today we are going to have a conversation in reference to Teresa Fry Brown, Dr. T, as we love to call her. Dr. Teresa Fry Brown is professor, now dean, she's now dean at the Emory University, the Candler School of Theology. I have to say at the outset, she is probably one of my favorite preachers, scholar, teachers in the world. We have her every year at Trinity United Church of Christ. I am a student of hers, and I've not been in her classes formally, but I study Dr. T. I read everything that she has written. She is an absolute blessing and just a wonderful human being, just an absolutely wonderful human being. What we're going to attempt to do, along with this lecture, I did an interview with Dr. T some years ago, and I'd like to upload that for the students so that you can hear her talk about how she learned about preaching. There's a very specific way in which she practices and engages the preaching moment, and she's just a delightful individual. The book that we're looking at is Delivering the Sermon by Dr. Teresa Fry Brown. This is from the Elements of Preaching series. The editor is O. Wesley Allen. You will want to get this entire series in your library. It goes through everything from delivering the sermon to talking about the theology that you come from. It goes through exegetical work, storytelling, you name it. They're very small. Here, I have a copy of it. They're not long books. They're very small, but they are packed with so much information, and I will guarantee you that if you get this entire series of books, not that I'm selling something here, but if you get this entire series of books, I believe that it is an amazing addition to your library. And that is The Elements of Preaching, edited by O. Wesley Allen. The Elements of Preaching. Some of you may be asking, I'm wearing this scarf. It is freezing here in Chicago, by the way. I think it says there's like a 1 or 2, 3 digit, 1 digit or something like that outside. I'm not sure what, but nonetheless, I just kept my scarf on because I'm going to have to go back outside after we do this lecture. And so today we're looking at delivering the sermon, specifically talking about Dr. Teresa Fry Brown. So let me begin this way in the manner in which Dr. T begins in her book. I'm going to add some things that that are from the book in terms of expanding on some of the elements that she deals with. We'll also have the interview with Dr. Brown, and so I'm looking forward to that, and that'll be an opportunity for you to delve in a little bit deeper. Jefferson, he's a black male. He's from Ohio. He comes from the Baptist tradition. Jefferson speaks in a variety of ways. He speaks in a standard English context, but then also a more informal, acculturated communication. Sometimes he replaces F where there should be a TH, but he communicates in an informal that goes back to a formal form of communication. That is Jefferson. Then there is Elizabeth. Elizabeth has never preached before. When she stands before the classroom to give her message, she keeps apologizing. She has a very quiet voice, and over she apologizes as she communicates, then moves to her text. And after communicating that particular text, then she quickly sits down. Then there is Terry. Terry places the manuscript on the pulpit. It has obviously been put together and laid out, printed out, but then moves away from what has been written and begins to walk around the pulpit area, moving around in front of the area where the students are present. He's sharing in highs and lows and communication. That is the way that Terry is communicating. Then there is Janie. Janie stands and is quiet for almost 2 or 3 minutes. Each word is very deliberate. Janie comes out of a Quaker tradition and moves very deliberately and slowly in her presentation. And then there's Scott. Scott comes and there is no manuscript. And Scott says, "Thus saith the Lord," and begins to repeat particular phrases over and over again. The Holy Spirit says, communicating back and forth. And he's moving around. And then as he is presenting for class, Scott stops and says, "The Spirit is telling me right now that there is somebody in this space who is in deep need. If they would come right now, we'll create an altar." Now, what I just did is what Dr. T does in her book. She lifts up the different types of people who come to a preaching class, come to seminary, who come to a university, or come to a workshop. Some have had experiences preaching. Some come out of particular traditions that share with them those traditions of how they should communicate. And then others are just brand new. This is a completely new thing. But what the book does, and what we want to talk about today, is the importance of delivery, but specifically communication. We want to talk about this idea of communication, and more specifically, language. Language is a means of self-expression. Language is a means of self-expression. Also, language is difficult. Language is hard. Language is challenging in order to share and communicate your particular ideas. So we know that language is a form of expression. And there are a variety of ways in which language is communicated. It is not just communicated by what you say. Now, that is orality, the spoken word, what flows from your mouth. That is orality. But there's also aurality, or what is oral, and that is with an A, oral. And that is the connection between the listener and the speaker. So what can be said may be heard in a radically different way. The oral, what you hear, the connection that you have with the person who is presenting the word. Now, it is the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein who says that communication is a language game. Communication builds community. So let me give everyone something very important. Do not forget this. As a preacher, you are trafficking in stories. You are a teacher and lover of language. You are a student of language. Because the primary way that you will be communicating will be the oral, the oral. It will also be kinetic. That means your movement. It will be how your body expresses, even how you present in terms of the clothes that you wear. So it is the preacher who is called to be the trafficker in stories, but also the student of language. Trafficker of stories, student of language. That is important to recognize as we go through this course. The trafficker of stories, student of language. If you are not a student of language, then there will always be people, communities that you will not be able to effectively communicate with because you choose to be a person who only wants to communicate in the context and with the language that you know. There is no requirement for you to be fluent in someone else's language, but there is a requirement for you to be sensitive and competent that you are moving into certain contexts. In our class on Tuesday, we are going to be looking at some ways in which we can communicate based on context and how our body, how our voice can help us in terms of that communication. Language is a game. And so I want to do something. Since language is a game, I'm going to share a story with you. This is a true story and been made up. This actually happened to me. And I want to give you the context in reference to this and why I share this story and why it is important for you to know as a preacher. When I started out in ministry, we lived in Augusta, Georgia, served at the Tabernacle Baptist Church, and there was an exchange between the Tabernacle Church and the First Baptist Church of Augusta. The First Baptist Church of Augusta was the church where the Southern Baptist Convention was formed. Our church was a part of the Progressive National Baptist Convention and the American Baptist Churches of the South. Background, let me give you background. The Progressive National Baptist Convention, PNBC. The PNBC was formed during the time period of the Freedom Movement. There was a National Baptist Convention. Dr. King was actually put out of the National Baptist Convention. The then president of the National Baptist Convention, Dr. J.H. Jackson, an absolutely extraordinary scholar and preacher, very conservative, but an extraordinary scholar and preacher, put Dr. King out. A group of ministers who were involved in the civil rights movement, my father was one of those, they formed the Progressive National Baptist Convention. Their first meeting was in Cincinnati, and it gave a denominational home for Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. So our church in Augusta was a part of that tradition. So the tradition of the freedom movement, of social justice, that was a part of the church tradition. The NAACP had an office at the church. The former pastor, Dr. C.S. Hamilton, Dr. Charles Hamilton, who at one time was the dean of the Morehouse School of Religion, was a part of the desegregation movement of Augusta. SCLC was a part of this church. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, on and on and on and on. You get it. It's ideas, social justice church. So one church, Tabernacle, that has a particular history, and then First Baptist has a particular history. Myself and Dr. Timothy Owings, who was the pastor of First Baptist, we had a really good relationship. We said we will do a pulpit swap. It was wonderful. Had a great time. Our church came over to First Baptist, our choir, our deacons, our trustees, our ushers, everybody just came through. And vice versa at Tabernacle. It was wonderful. But then something happened that deals with language and context. I was in my 20s at the time, and a member of First Baptist came up, and to give a compliment, I want to add, to come to give a compliment, and said this in front of several deacons who were in their 70s and 80s. I quote, "Otis, you did a great job. Otis, we got to have you back. over at First Baptist. Oh, you ought to be proud of Otis. This is a good young man right here. Man didn't realize what had happened. At that moment, several of my deacons were livid. Let me stop. Write down on canvas right now why you think the deacons were livid. I'll pause for a moment. The deacons were livid. One in particular by the name of Deacon Hewlin Johnson. He was a Korean War veteran. And I thought a fight was about to break out at First Baptist. He told that man off. And he said this: "Don't you ever refer to my pastor by his first name that way. You may say pastor, you may say minister, you may say reverend, you may say doctor, you may say sir, but you will not call him Otis ever." What was the context? Here is the context. It's right over here. First of all, we were in the South, right over here on the right. Second, we were in church. This is the church. Third, black community. The next, male. Why is that context and language important? To many, especially to Deacon Hewlin Johnson, it was the utmost act of disrespect to call the pastor by the first name. Why was that an act of disrespect? Because in the South, to disrespect and disregard black people who had been educated or received a degree or whatever it may be, white people would often use a person's first name to, quote, put them in their place. You were called boy, girl, auntie, whatever, and then a first name. You could be 70, 80 years old, and a child would call you, "Hey, Hewlin." No one would ever call Hewlin Johnson by his first name. He was 6'4". I think at 82, he could take out anybody. We called him Sarge because he was a master sergeant in the Marines. He was no joke. I mean, this man was no joke. So the context was, this individual did not know the context. And by calling me by my first name, because language is a game, he ended up offending everyone around him and did not realize it. So as preachers, you are to be a student of language. If you want to be heard, you've got to know your context. So we understand this, that language is a game, but then we also must understand, as we talk about preaching, that sacred rhetoric is transmitted by various channels. There is written, there is the oral, there is movement, small groups, dance, digital. So just for a moment, I want you to place on canvas, what are ways in which sacred rhetoric is communicated that I did not mention? What are ways that sacred rhetoric is communicated that I did not mention? I'll pause, and then you can place the information in the chat. So let us continue. So this is important to know this, that sacred rhetoric can be communicated in a variety of channels, in a variety of ways. But this is one of the most important aspects for the preacher to understand. The sender must be trusted by the hearer. If you want to be able to communicate effectively, it's not just your exegesis, it's not just the volume of your voice. Can you be trusted? Will you communicate without manipulation? Will you communicate authentically? My mother gave some wise counsel and stated something years ago, and it still rings in my spirit. She was talking about Dr. J. Alfred Smith, the pastor emeritus of the Allen Temple Baptist Church in California, specifically, it's Oakland, California, specifically. And he is a master preacher. But my mother said this, because my grandmother used to love to attend his church. She lived in Vallejo, California. They would drive down like once a month so she could hear Dr. Smith preach. She loved Dr. Smith. He's just a wonderful, warm, amazing human being. But she said this, my mother said this, said he's a master teacher, but he is an extraordinary pastor. And then said this, pastoring, Otis, will get you places preaching cannot. She went on to say, she said, it is the sermon that you live that allows you into the hearts of people. The sermon that you live. So there are tremendous preachers that people like to hear, but they don't want to be hanging around them after they get out of the pulpit. But they're good in the pulpit. But once they leave, don't nobody want to be around them because they're dangerous. But she said, Dr. Smith, this elder preacher, he isn't a master preacher, but an extraordinary pastor. And she said that pastoring will get you places preaching cannot. Think about that example from my mother, Edwina Moss. When we think about the life of Jesus, of the words that he preached, but the actions that he lived. So this idea of delivering the word must also incorporate not just your presentation of what comes out of your mouth, but it must also be rooted in your moral and spiritual compass. Raising those questions, because there are certain things that cannot be heard from a person speaking whose life is also damaging to the congregation. Now, it's one thing to give testimony. People have overcome. People deal with a variety of different things. We all do. But it's another thing to manipulate and to live a life that is damaging to the people. That is also a part of the communication. So the sender must trust the person, the hearer must trust the sender. And the next piece, when we talk about the preaching moment, this is an exchange of communication. Now, Fred Craddock gives a wonderful quote. I'm going to give some more things along this line. He says that the longest trip a person takes is from the head to the heart. And the most difficult aspect of preaching that you will deal with is moving from the head to the heart and learning how to communicate for head and also communicate for heart. It's easy to give facts. It's easy to do analysis. But how does one become authentic to be able to communicate that which comes from the heart? The longest trip that we will make. The other aspects of communication and of language that we need to know is this aspect. You'll see it in the lower third. Signs. Signs. Now, communication involves the oral. Communication involves the oral, that which you hear and you assign to it, but also signs. Well, what do you mean, Rev? Well, if you are driving down the street and you see a red sign at a corner, it says stop on it, but it's the shape of the sign that indicates to you that you are to stop. If it's a triangle, it means you better slow down. If you come to a corner and there are lights, even though there are no words whatsoever, you see the color red, so I better stop. Color yellow, well, some of y'all just mean speed up. And then green, go. Those are signs. Biblically, we also recognize signs. Every Christmas, we talk about that there was a star in the sky that drew 3 wise men. As people of faith, we talk about the cross is a sign. So that is a particular image, a sign, a sensory input through my eyes, or it may be through my ears. You hear certain chords, and all of a sudden you know a certain song. You know the words to that. There are certain chords that you hear, you know that that song is communicating something that is joyous, or other chords communicating something somber, or just a ding dong. I just made that noise. You assume that I'm talking about a doorbell. Those are signs. Or it could be texture. For example, those who are differently able and unable to see, they use Braille. And by touch, they know exactly what something says. Or for a musician, when they sit at a piano, they can touch the keys. They know that the raised keys are black keys. The ones that are not raised are the white keys. They know the major and minor notes through touch. Through touch. Through touch. So there are signs. And then there's also signification. Signification, or you've heard the word signifying. Signifying or signification is when we assign meaning to something. So I've assigned meaning. So now everybody goes to a corner. They see some colors, red, yellow, or green. We've assigned meaning to red, yellow, and green. We assign meaning. And as a preacher, you are going to be working with signs and signifying, assigning meaning. And sometimes you're going to have to decolonize the signs, decolonize the signification. For example, there are some, especially in the Western world, that says that those things of a darker hue are negative. In another culture, those things of a lighter hue are negative. We have to decolonize some of those things because guess what? We do not want the hearer, when something is spoken by the sender, to create trauma for this individual. So we sometimes have to decolonize, deconstruct the signs and the signification. You all with me? All right. Now we're going to continue to go on a little bit deeper in this because there's some things that we need to understand. We need to understand the land and the terrain you have to do. If you are going to deliver a word, you have to, here it is, exegete your congregation or your audience. Let me say it again. Exegete. You got to do some exegesis of the congregation and the audience. So here are some things that you've got to know. You've got to know your context. Is this urban? Is this suburban? Is this rural? Is this Midwest? Is this South? Is this East? What denomination is it? But in that denomination, you need to know. Currently, I serve in the United Church of Christ, predominantly white denomination. But you come to Trinity, Trinity is unashamedly black, unapologetically Christian. So our tradition, if you were to come to our church, some people would say, y'all very Baptist-costal around here. I don't know if it's Pentecostal one day. I don't know if it's Baptist another day. That's the context. So knowing that context is incredibly important. Knowing the history for every person who serves in a church, a historic church. Let me share a story with you. Something very important I learned at Tabernacle Baptist Church. Currently, the pastor there is Charles Goodman. He's an extraordinary preacher too. Oh my gosh, you really need to hear him. And One of the things that I learned, this was a historic church. When I came there, it was 120-something years old when I got there. Very historic church, founded by C.T. Walker, who at the turn of the century was considered to be one of the greatest American preachers, period, bar none. C.T. Walker, he was a legend. All kinds of stories were told about him. So one of the things that I decided that I was going to be the griot for the church. What does that mean? It means that I was going to be the holder of the history for the church. It was a historic church, and as many historic middle-class churches do, there's history and then there's myth that is created. So I wanted to be the one that held the history and could share the stories, and we could put away some of the myths about what can and cannot be done in the church. So when someone said one Sunday, we hadn't been there but a week, we don't say amen in this church, I said, okay. I went and did my research, talked to the elders in the church, and found out more history and started reading from the Augusta Historical Society. And when I actually found some newspaper stories that indicated how the folk were shouting all over the place in Tabernacle Baptist Church, I now had history on my side. Now, not to embarrass the person that told me that, but then to be able to incorporate the history as I would teach and as I would preach, that this is normative because I was doing the work of decolonization. Because part of the role of preaching is not just in the pulpit, but it's in all the other aspects that we do. So that is an example of how you must learn how to exegete. And when I went to First Baptist, as I shared the story of the pulpit exchange, I had the history of the current preacher, I had the history of the congregation, but I also had in my back pocket the stories of members in that congregation. Stories of certain members who broke with the position of the Southern Baptist Convention to support the work of Tabernacle Baptist Church in the same city, doing the exegesis. And people are like, oh my gosh, you didn't know it. Some people did, but didn't share it. And so you have to be a person who is exegeting the context where you are. Understanding the context is incredibly important. And then since you traffic in stories and you are a student of language, you then can learn how to shape and communicate to help and heal and not harm and create trauma by being a student of the language and being a trafficker of great stories. So you got to exegete the congregation. That is one thing that we have to do. The other piece is that you also have to exegete yourself. Your age, your gender, how you grew up. You've got to know where your biases sit. You've got to know where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are. For example, I had to preach in a church in South Carolina. That church tradition was singing. I don't sing, can't sing. Everybody would run out of here right now. Even though a couple of people in the whole church, they would all run out screaming right at this moment if they heard me singing. Don't do that. Can't. But I had to understand I don't have that strength. So what do? Since I don't have that strength, I tell the folk, I don't do that. But guess what? I brought with me someone who can. Okay, but I knew that the context, there was going to be an expectation for me to do something that I don't have the skill set to do. So why would I try to do something that I can't do, don't have the skill set for, and in the process, offend everybody in the space? Again, exegeting yourself becomes paramount because we are traffickers in stories. We are students. We are students of the language. So you have to exegete yourself. You have to exegete that, what do you wear in the pulpit? And you have to know when you go to another space, are they expecting you to wear a robe? Are they expecting you to wear a suit? Is this a congregation that, well, they're really expecting you to wear some jeans and a shirt? I don't know. But you need to that's your responsibility to find that out. Now, in some spaces, I mean, you can be safe, especially if you're of a particular age. If you just wear a suit anywhere, you're going to be fine. And people are going to expect you. Like my dad, I mean, the running joke with my father is we've never seen him wear jeans ever in his life. He's from Troup County, Georgia. He said, I wore jeans enough in the field. I associate jeans with the field. He has a pair of Pumas that he purchased in 1979. They are still in the box. He never wore them. I told him he is to will them to me because I can sell them on eBay for about $8,000. That's my father. He wears a suit all the time, and there is a reason behind it, but because of his age and his stature, that wherever he would be fine because of that deep respect that communities have of elders. So he could wear a suit. But I've got to exegete. I got to find out what is the appropriate attire wherever I go because I'm of a different era. I'm of a different age. And so exegeting and understanding what you wear is also very important. For example, it may be particular colors. There may be a liturgical congregation. You don't need to wear red or red robe. That may be something that they wear once a year, something very special. Or if you come to Trinity, guess what? You're safe wearing African attire pretty much any time here at our church. You can see the background of our stained glass right here on our LED screen. And so exegeting yourself, exegeting your verbal and nonverbal cues, how you communicate, how you stand, what are the traditional things that you do in a pulpit. And I know some people who come in the pulpit, they take their shoes off in the pulpit when they preach, knowing these things and knowing the things that you do and knowing the culture of the space that you're going into. Along with your message, the message that you present, will it connect with this? I want to tell you one of the biggest, flunks that I ever had in my life. I thought I was doing something. I did it twice because I was being a little bit arrogant, I think, at the same time. I had this message that I do every year at Trinity. They're with it. I do this piece on Tamar, talking about this kind of trauma and the brutality of dealing with sexual violence. And I was invited to Mississippi it was a Pentecostal convention by bishops. And I gave this message and it fell flat. Now, I thought, well, I'm just going to tell the bishops, they need to hear this, especially these men, blah, 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 blah. But if your message falls flat and the hearers now, no longer trust the sender, was the word even presented? There's so many different things that I could have done. Now that I'm older, I would have done things differently. But I was so engaged that I had to preach this. I was so engaged that this needs to be heard by bishops and ministers and so on and so on. They didn't hear nothing. They were just mad at me for lifting something up. Now, I could have presented it in a way that they could have heard it, but I was too young to recognize that I should have been a student of the language and a trafficker in the stories. And again, I was never invited ever again by those bishops in Mississippi. To this day, they probably say, what is wrong with that moss? Anyway, but nonetheless, I had a great lesson because flunking is one of the greatest lessons that you can have in preaching. I'm here to let you know. Can I get a witness? Can I get a witness? And as a preacher, in the contemporary context, you are a trafficker of stories. You are a student of language. But as you work on your messages, you need to know that Google is over your shoulder. So you just cannot, you don't have the luxury of just saying someone said or something you just heard. It requires, in this day and age, 50, 60 years ago, there was a level of authority that was assigned to the preacher. No longer. It means that you have to do double duty. You've got to do your work. And doing research doesn't mean just looking up Google, because everybody's going to be Googling the stuff you say. You have to love and learn the beauty of reading historians from different contexts. Don't just read for confirmation bias. This is all a part and wrapped up in this idea of delivering. There must be a way in which you exegete the congregation, the audience, exegete yourself, just as you are exegeting the message. So there are 3 aspects to exegeting. Exegete the congregation. Exegete yourself. And you're going to have to do exegesis for the message that you are presenting. If you remember those 3 aspects, the 3 ways that you have to exegete, then you will be better prepared when you are preaching. Now, let us move a little bit forward here for our understanding in terms of delivery of the word. As a preacher, you have to work on sentence structure. You have to know what complete and incomplete sentences are. You must be a trafficker in language, trafficker in story and student of language, which means you've got to know when subjects and verbs do not agree. And learning the pronunciation of words, and the beautiful thing that you now have is the internet. You can actually go and have someone pronounce particular words if it's a word that you don't quite know how to pronounce. And sometimes we have heard people mispronounce words so long in our lives, we assume that it's the right pronunciation, and we all do it, and we all stumble over stuff. I do it all the time. I had to do my own audiobook, and I realized that I was mispronouncing someone's name I had been pronouncing all of these years with historical name, because I had heard someone mispronounce that name and I picked it up. So there's always, you're a student, you're doing the work, and doing the work in terms of language. Now, that does not mean that you cannot fall and move into your own particular cultural context. If you speak a particular patois, if there is a certain way in which you communicate or an accent, don't get rid of it. Please don't. But learn how to be multilingual, have multiple dialects to communicate will be more effective. Because there's some stories that you have to say that have every I dotted. And some that you're going to have to use some contractions and translate into some modern language so that people understand. That's part of your role when you are delivering the word. All right? Now, I want to give you some of the exercises that are lifted up in such a beautiful way by Dr. T. Now, I'm not going to give all of them because you can read most of them for yourselves, but I am going to ask you to do this. I'm going to ask you that you would take your phone or whatever particular device you have and find a scripture. Let's say the 23rd Psalm. And I want you to record yourself reading the 23rd Psalm to understand your vocal quality. Understand your highs and your lows, to understand your vocal quality. So just record yourself reading the 23rd Psalm. Understand your vocal quality. Now let me pull it up here. And then here are some exercises for voicing the word. The one is your diction and your pronunciation. For example, if you want to strengthen your voice, when you are ill, you should be quiet. Don't whisper, because whispering actually puts more pressure on your vocal mechanism. Learn how you are breathing, how you breathe when you communicate, and the practice of breathing. You'll find this in chapter 3 in Voicing of the Word. The posture that you have will affect how you communicate, and whether your jaw is tight will affect, and then working through volume. So take the 23rd Psalm, and I want you to record reading the 23rd Psalm sitting. Just record yourself sitting, 23rd Psalm. Then I want you to record it while you're standing. I want you to record with your shoulders back, reading the 23rd Psalm. Then I want you to close your eyes, take a breath, relax your body, and then record yourself saying the 23rd Psalm. Relaxing yourself. Then I want you to think about holding your hand at your diaphragm, relaxing your diaphragm, relaxing yourself as you record yourself giving the 23rd Psalm. Don't delete any of the recordings. What you are to do in the chat on Canvas is to talk about the differences you heard as you recorded in different ways. You recorded sitting, you recorded standing, you recorded with your shoulders back, you recorded after trying to relax, you recorded with your hand on your diaphragm. What are the differences that you heard? And here's the final recording. Record the 23rd Psalm the entire time. You are to smile. Smile as you are recording it and pronouncing the words. What differences did you notice? That concludes this lecture. We have more exercises for you. I hope the exercises today in reference to delivering the word. Going through this book by Dr. T is an extraordinary book that will assist you for your delivery of the word. Dr. Teresa Fry Brown, as I said, is one of my favorite preachers. I'm going to ask that William will help me find. We're going to find that interview we did with her. We have two, and we want to place those in Canvas in the chat. You will love to hear Dr. T as she communicates about her experience and her development as a preacher. I'm sure that it will bless you. Look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. God bless.